Hi, everyone. Welcome to Eduonix Learning Solutions, another live training session with Eduonix. I am your host, Vivek, and I have our instructor today with us, Mr. Gray Lewis, as well. Yeah, before we get started, just wanted to check with a few things. Just want to let you know that this is the last of the series of the sessions which we have been conducting over the period of the last month. So really thank each and every one of you who have been registered and have been patient to be a part of this wonderful session. So today we have a lot of things which we have decided, not just the giveaways which we normally do during the session, but also we do have a surprise for each and every one of you who are keen to learn and understand more. And right now, yeah, I see a lot of highs. Okay, guys, not audible. Okay, so just want to check, first of all, am I audible to each one of you? Just put yes on the chat if you can hear me. All righty, great. Thank you. Okay, such an awesome response. Okay, so just to understand from each one of you, so which country are you attending this session from? Can you put your country name, please? Okay, so lots and lots of different countries in one. Okay, awesome. All right, great. So we have a lot of people across the world who have spared a little time during a weekday. I must say thank you to each and every one of you. Also to our instructor, Mr. Gray Lewis, for sharing time, for spending time with and his expertise with us for this lovely session, guys. Just for the benefit of others who may have been joining a little late, I see already 100 participants. So thank you, each and every one of you. Thank you so very much for being so patient. So we'll start the session in about next 30 seconds. But before I do that, just wanted to understand your expectations in maybe just in just one line. You can just put expectations or what kind of things which you are expecting from today's session, so that we are aware as to what you are expecting from today's session. So guys, you can just put everything on the chat. You have just another 10 seconds. Quickly, guys, come on. Okay. Fennel, practical, I think something which I can only answer for you. Practical is something which is not possible on a 90-minute session, honestly speaking. So I would let you know about the practice. Yeah, most of us are eager to learn a hands-on practice. I have a solution for it. I promise you that you will like the solution, and of course, along with it, there will be a surprise as well. All right, guys. Yes, one more thing is, before we move ahead, I will first let you know, in case that you are in requirement, or if you need the recording will be updated on the Eduonix dashboard after 24 hours of the session. All right, so the PPT or the presentation which is being shared, which will be into a zip file and will be shared on your Eduonix dashboard. In case you miss out anything, you can also refer to it, but it will be updated after 24 hours of this wonderful session. So guys, okay, let's not take time. We are 4 minutes into the session. 100 participants, awesome number, and I am not taking much of your time or boring you at all. Let me introduce Mr. Gray Lewis, one of the experienced personalities from all the way from Holland, and he's going to take over the mic. I'll just put myself on mute. Oh, Gray, are you there?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for showing up. like you said, on a weekday. I'm super excited to give a little bit of information. I hope that this ends up being a super useful session for you guys. As you can tell by the title and by the fact that you signed up for this, we're going to be building a RESTful API using a framework known as Express, which runs on Node.js. And yeah, so let's get started. So I'm Gray Lewis. I have been working as a software engineer, or at least...
Sorry, Gray. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. One of the members was saying there's no sound. Can rest of you guys confirm if you can hear Gray very clearly? Just put yes on the chat, please. Okay, so there's a lot of yes. So people who can't hear, just reconnect. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, Gray. We can get started. Sorry about that.
No worries. But yes, I'm Gray Lewis. I've been working in software since I was about 16 years old, so a little bit of experience under my belt. You can see my socials there if you want to reach out afterwards and talk about anything about engineering. I'm a full stack engineer specifically. I'm a big fan of having my fingers all the way through the stack. Yeah, so I'm super excited to dive in to this this interesting and exciting subject. So what exactly are we going to be covering today? So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about what makes a RESTful API RESTful. So what are these RESTful principles that you may have heard about before? I'm going to actually run you through some of the basic coding. I'll be, just writing the code and explaining the pieces as I go along. You might want to follow along in VS Code if you have the energy. And we'll also be doing a little Q&A as well. I also want to touch a little bit on some more fundamental things like talking about schemas for NoSQL databases and some security concerns, which are always important to consider when we're building web applications, but especially when we're building RESTful APIs. So RESTful backends are actually one of my favorite patterns for building out applications. They're super convenient for a number of reasons, but the main thing that they accomplish for us is access to the CRUD or create, read, update, delete functions that we need for handling user data throughout an application. And they are going to, connect to some front end. Although today I won't be talking too much about the front end that might be theoretically connected to the RESTful API. And as someone had talked about in chat, there are also, public APIs that you can consume as a user, as a developer. These actually function essentially the same, because one of the great things about RESTful backends is the uniform interface that they provide. So they provide this super standard way to have different components of your application communicate over HTTP protocols, which is super great because it's convenient. We're all familiar with it for the most part, if you're somewhat familiar with web development. And they offer a number of other advantages, namely that they are stateless, meaning that there is no, at any point throughout the process of visiting the website, the backend server doesn't really need to actually store information about what you've already done with the website, but rather it tries to isolate each function to its own purposes, right? So we don't have any side effects. And it's also very cacheable, which means that the users can take the results from the RESTful API and store them on their end, and then they won't have to make that request again, unless the data has been updated. So those are the essential principles of a RESTful backend and what exactly that means for us. And so today, we're going to be building a RESTful backend using a framework called Express. And for any of my JavaScript developers out there, you're very familiar with Node.js, which is a server-side runtime for running JavaScript. And it's fantastic because it allows us to completely standardize the language in which we're writing the front end and the back end. And so we can use this Express plus Node framework plus runtime package to really rapidly build out a backend API and expose endpoints for our front end, or maybe just users that we want to expose the API to connect to. Right, so I also want to quickly cover, before I jump into part of the demonstration, the kind of database that we're going to be using for this example. So a lot of you may be more familiar with traditional SQL databases, which are a little more structured and uses tables and relationships to model data, right? And we might expect, for example, that in a SQL database, the data is extremely uniform in its format and its structure. So we would expect the same amount of pieces of information to be available for all and defined for all items in that table, according to its schema. Whereas the no SQL databases, which really just means any any database that isn't SQL, tend to have other features. The one we'll be using today is MongoDB. And the great thing about MongoDB is it uses a super familiar JSON, although a binary form of JSON called BSON, formatting to structure and store the data, which means that it's really great for working with Node.js, because a lot of the outputs that we'll be generating through the data processing we'll handle on the backend will spit out JavaScript objects, which we can then parse directly into data that can be put into our database. And then one more piece of information, we have Mongoose, which is another important piece of software that we're going to be using today. Mongoose basically allows us to get back a little bit of the stability and predictability that SQL databases typically would offer, and brings that to MongoDB. So we basically can create schemas that are enforced upon our data, but only at the software level. So rather than actually having it be a part of the database, rather we're going to, as a part of our server logic, define what is valid data that can be input into our database. And it also then makes sure that the types are correct and the data will always then come in quite a predictable format. Right. So I saw someone was a bit confused about what an API actually is, and I'll give a very brief explanation. An API is just basically a standard way to provide like responses and handle requests over the internet. So basically it's the technology that is behind a web browser request, except we're just going to do it in text and handle only the data rather than rendering some web page. So it's a stripped down protocol and sort of pattern for communicating over the web. All right, so now I'm going to actually switch over to VS Code. Give me 1 second to switch, and I'll actually start running you guys through what we have to do. So here we are. So here we are in our VS Code editor. The first thing that we're going to do when we're creating an Express application, or any Node application for that matter, is to go ahead and use our npm init. Let me quickly get into the right folder here. So if we just go ahead and do npm init, then we can quickly generate the package JSON code, the package JSON file rather, that we need to get started. So I'm just going to go ahead and set all the default except for the name. Yes, and now you can see we have this package.json file. In Node.js, we have this concept of scripts, and basically scripts are just very simple terminal commands or command line commands on Windows that are going to allow us to tell the server how to start our endpoint. And I'm going to be using something called nodemon, which is going to give us live reload capabilities. And I'm going to have it run a file, a entry point into our project called server.js. So if So if I went ahead and created server.js in our file here, or in our folder here rather, then we can now have our entry point into the application, the file that we will run to actually start our RESTful API. And so now we're going to have to install a bunch of packages off of Node Package Manager. I'm assuming, by the way, for this session that you are at least somewhat familiar with the absolute basics of Node and Node Package Manager, but this is really simple information that you can find out online. This is just going to handle package installation and dependencies. So a few things that we're going to have to install, and we can do that using npm I, and then -- save to add it to our manifest. We're going to have to install bcrypt for hashing our passwords. We're going to have to install cores for handling cross-origin request validation. We're going to have to install .env, which is going to allow us to prevent secrets from being exposed. And I'll go over, once we actually implement using these tools, what these do individually. And then we'll go install the Express Validator, as well as Mongoose, Passport, and Passport JWT. And what those last two libraries are going to do for us is actually give us a lot of the boilerplate and a lot of the functionality that we need for handling authentication. So username and password verification, essentially. Although in this case, we will, once we hit the login of the server and that's done, we'll actually be switching to a JSON web token based authentication, which is quite standard for APIs. So while that's installing, let's start writing some code, shall we? So the first thing that we're going to do in almost any project using Node is to configure our environment. And a lot of you may be familiar with this. The environment variables are essentially these core variables that your operating system exposes for you that you can set in Windows through GUI, and in Linux, Mac, and Windows through the command line. And basically, it allows us to handle environment-specific variables. So, for example, I might have two different development environments that I'm going to run this code in. One of them might be on the cloud through something like Amazon Web Services, and one might just be as localhost, right? And I don't want to have to store passwords or any sort of secret information that can't be leaked. I don't want to store that publicly as a part of my app bundle. But if we use this .env file and we don't commit this to our GitHub repository, then basically what we'll be able to do is keep this a secret and stop it from being exposed to the world. But this .env file will actually load these key value pairs into the environment variable system that our operating system itself exposes. So we're going to configure and initialize .env using this syntax here. We're then going to go ahead and import all of those libraries that we just required, or installed rather. And then we're going to do a couple important things. First of all, we're going to take the MongoDB key environment variable out of process.env, and that's the logic that's actually going to allow us to access this fake password example. Obviously, I'm not just going to expose real passwords to all of you, and store it as a variable so that we can use that when setting up our connection to the database. And then we're going to actually parse that. So here we have what is called a Mongo URI. I'm trying to keep up the pace because we don't have much time. This Mongo URI is all of the information that our client needs, and that Mongoose, that database driver that we touched on a little bit earlier, is going to need to connect and make a secure connection. And then we're going to handle the actual connection logic. So Mongoose is going to expose the .connect method. And then we're going to use these boilerplate options that are just to use the most up-to-date, most secure connection options. And then it's going to return a promise, which we're going to attach a then statement to, which is going to just basically, once we connect, tell us that we've connected to the console. And then we have to go ahead and initialize Express, which is the framework that we're going to be using for handling requests. So Express allows us to use JavaScript to create web servers. So we're going to be able to set up specific patterns of interaction based on endpoints, based on URLs, basically, right? So I can specify at localhost / home, we're going to return a certain response. And that's what Express basically allows us to do. And then additionally, we're going to be using what Express calls middleware. So this .use method here is going to attach a function. Although actually we don't need to use this, but that's an example. Is going to attach a function that is going to intercept every request, right? So requests are going to come in through my internet. And once that request comes in, Express is going to handle it. In between the request that we receive and the response that we're going to send back, there's going to be a number of steps, right? And each one of these middlewares is a separate step that it will be run through. And I will actually be writing a piece of custom middleware later that you will be able to see exactly how that works. So these are just a couple middlewares that are going to allow us to decode the response coming in and turn it into an actual JavaScript object. And then also it's going to allow us to handle encoded data in the URL. It's not super important to understand the details of that, but yes. Here I'm defining the port that we're going to run our server on based on either the environment variable that we've defined, but if there is no environment variable defined, we will short circuit to a default of port 5000, which we will be using today. And then here is a whitelist. So some of you might be familiar with the idea of a cross-origin resource. I think CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing. The security problems that come along with that kind of connection. And what we mean when we say cross-origin is actually that one web server is reaching out to another web server. So for example, if I had a front end, if I had an interface connected to this back end, we would need that front end, which might be hosted on one web server, to actually make requests to another server. So my user might connect to an app that I created, and the code that I write as part of that app will need to reach out to another app, this app that we're building right now, this backend, to tell it exactly what processing the server needs to do to serve the user's needs. But there are some security concerns associated with that kind of connection. And so we cannot just allow them to happen regardless. Let's say, for example, I am a malicious website, right? And users connect to my website, download my app, and then I just decide, all right, I'm going to send out a web connection to their bank account, which their bank account will think it's legitimately them because it's coming from their IP address and might even have authentication cookies attached, which would be very problematic, right? And then I can just hijack their session like that. This sort of stops that problem. So this stops what we call cross-site scripting attacks, XSS attacks, which I'll actually get a little bit more into later. And then using this whitelist of addresses, we are going to create our CORS options, which we are then going to pass to the CORS middleware that we installed earlier. After that, it's a simple matter of actually running our server. So let's go ahead and make sure that the work that we've done so far is working. We go ahead and use that script that we defined earlier in our package.json file, and we'll see that indeed our server is running as expected and the database is connecting just fine. So great, we're done with our first step. A big first step, but we're done with our first step. Again, I'm sorry if we're moving a little too fast, but we don't have much time. This recording will be available. If you want to reach out to rectify some misunderstandings or some just missed points, please reach out to me on Twitter. I'm always interested in talking about coding, but we got to keep moving on. So where are these routes that I was mentioning earlier, right? So separation of concerns tells us that we should actually go ahead and make a new file for our routes just to keep them all in one simple place. And in order to do that, we're going to have to actually pass as middleware our routes. So here we have the routes being imported and given to Express. Sorry, I don't know why I muted. When did I mute? When I was just talking about imports, right?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay. So once we do that, all we have to do is go ahead and define some routes. Although there's going to be more we'll have to do in this file later, let's just do this as a test. So here we have a router.get. Basically, what we're doing here is declaring a route which we are attaching to the Express router system. And what we're saying is that anytime that an incoming request matches this URL, so that would look something like someone visiting the website http://www. Maybe let's just say it's at localhost slash. And if it is only that, right? So if we're only at that top level, there's only a slash, there's nothing after it. Maybe if I put here user, then it would be user, right? But here, if there's no if there's no like further domain provided except for the top, just the actual name of the website, then this is the default route that we're going to have. And if we go ahead and run our server again, we can see that working. And now I do want to do one more thing. Some of you might be familiar with Postman. Postman is a tool for investigating how REST APIs are functioning and crafting requests to see how it works. We're seeing that there's actually a slight problem here at line 21. I'm not sure why. App.use requires a Not sure what that is. I will just go ahead and check that out. $42. Okay. I'm not exactly sure why it's doing that, but I think that if we actually define our routes a little more, then we'll be fine. So we have this function now, which is basically going to handle that one route. And then we have to go ahead and export the router. That should solve the problem. So we have module.exports set to router, which means that the actual Express router is going to be the export, which is why we can now put this in this file separately and use it in essentially the same way as if we just defined it in the server.js file. So there we are. And then we should see that it is fixed. And if we go ahead and open Postman, which I will have to share to show you, or even Google Chrome, but for now I'm just going to use Postman. Let me create a new request here and then show you. So here we are in Postman. This is a piece of software that if you're working with APIs, you will get very used to. So if we go ahead and just hit up slash, we'll see that indeed we're getting the exact response that we would expect, right? So that's exactly how we define routes in Express, and we're going to now build out more complex functionality to provide. So we're about 15 minutes away from the halfway point. So I'm going to try to really hurry through the authentication phase, because I think that that is one of the most important and useful things to know how to do using a API. And also I want to focus a little bit on security concerns. So as I was talking about earlier, we're going to be using a library called Passport.js to handle the authentication for us. And in order to do that, we're going to have to create some configuration files, essentially. And so I'm going to create a new folder here, features, in which I'm going to store all of these boilerplate configuration files that we need. The first thing I'm going to create is a file called jwt.js. And the second one I'm going to create is going to be called authenticate.js. So jwt.js, which I've just pasted in here, and I'm going to break down quickly. Oh, of course, you're still on Postman. So this JWT file, which I've now created, is basically going to define how the passport.js function is going to handle the data coming in. So we are basically using this new JWT class. We're instantiating a JWT strategy class, and then we're telling it exactly what it should do in order to look for the token and check that the token is indeed valid, as we would expect. And here we're seeing some just options that has a lot to just do with how passport.js handles its configuration. And I don't want to go too far into that. And then here we have our authenticate file. What our authenticate file is going to do is actually sort of coordinate these efforts. So it's going to call that function that we defined in the other file. And it's also going to intercept each request, check if it's authenticated. If it's not authenticated, or if it is authenticated, rather, it's going to attach the user object to that request so that once we go past this phase, we'll be able to know which user is associated with which request. And then obviously, if there is some sort of authentication problem, then we're just going to go ahead and throw an error. So that's basically all we need to do in terms of those configurations for passport.js. Now, all we have to do is go into our server file, first of all, and go ahead and configure it to use that type of authentication, and then do the same in routes. So the first thing that we're going to do to make this, or actually it's all in routes now that I think about it. So let's go back to routes. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is import the auth controller here, and we're going to have to create this auth controller. I'm going to create a new folder for putting the controllers in, and I mean controller in the model view controller sense here, which you might be familiar with the NVC split, which is basically a way to handle separation of concerns. Don't worry if that's not meaning anything to you. It's not that important. And then what we're going to do is import the JWT. Additionally, I'm going to, and I know we're doing a lot all at once here, but I'm going to make another folder for models. And what these are going to be are schemas for Mongoose, which we discussed earlier. So first thing I'm going to do in here is I'm going to write a login function. And so what we're doing here is we're going to accept the request and the response. This is going to be a post request that would be posted here. And then as the person posts, we're going to take the email and password that they provided. We're going to try to check their email, see if it exists. If it does exist, that means that if that user doesn't exist, that means that the email isn't registered and we should return an error. And then we're going to validate their password if the user does exist using a hash function, bcrypt. And then we're going to go ahead and return them a JWT, a JSON web token to handle further authentication after that. So very simple stuff. And then we're going to actually go back now to the routes and write out the actual endpoint that the person is going to need, the potential user is going to need to go ahead and access this login function. So here at the /login route, we're going to go ahead and go to auth login, that function that we just wrote. And here you see something called check. And what check is a method provided by the Express Validator library. And what it's going to do for us is it's going to make sure that users are indeed providing valid input and that it's not potentially hazardous or even malicious. And we'll be going over that more in a bit later once I go over the security concerns. And now we're going to create those models that I touched upon. The first model that we're going to be making is token.js. So token.js is basically going to define how tokens are stored. And you can see that it has a few properties. I will be going over Mongo schema tips and exactly how schemas work later in my presentation. But for now, just so we can see the demo functioning, we basically have an ID, the actual token string, and then a created at value. And then additionally, we're going to create our user model, which is going to contain a lot of information, which I'm going to go over one by one. So first, we're going to have to import bcrypt, mongoose, and JWT for the schema. We're going to define the basic schema, which is made up of an email, password, first name, and last name. So each user has these data registered at their object in the database. Then we're going to actually create a method. So what this method is going to do is before any user gets saved to the database. So this is when we're going through the registration process. We're going to encrypt their password before it even gets stored. So that's what this pre-function does. And then anytime that it's modified as well, we're going to do the same thing again. So this is going to use bcrypt to hash that password, salt it as well, and then store that in the database. Then here we have a very simple method. It's just going to allow us to compare different passwords. And then here we have the generate the JWT method, which we're going to use to inject the payload into the JWT token. I can go over a little bit more if we have time, the JWT authentication scheme and what that means. But the main thing you need to understand is that the JWT is going to be signed. So it's cryptographically provable that I'm the person who generated this, meaning that we can trust that user if they have access to it, right? We know that they at some point did actually authenticate with the server because we know I verified this token that they now have. And yes, that is basically the main things that we have to do here for getting started with our logging in system. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the registration system. The main thing we're going to have to do there is go ahead and add the register method to our authentication controller as so. And you'll see that this is basically the opposite of the first one. So we're going to check if there's a user at that email that they provided. If there is, then we know actually you're already registered and we send back an error. If there isn't, then we're going to form a new user based on the request and then save that in the database and then send them back their user. Yes, so that's the primary thing we have to do there. And then let me see if I have missed anything. I don't believe I have. Yes, so let's go ahead and actually try to make a request. So I have some examples here. So firstly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be sending a request like this to test. And yes, I will go over the middlewares. I'm trying to get through this demo so we have time to talk and do a Q&A. So yeah, let's focus. Here we have the example at eduonix.com email, an example password, a username, which is also the same as my first name in this case, and a last name. And if we send this, cannot post register. Oh, right, we forgot to define the routes. My bad. This is how it is when dealing with being a full stack engineer. You're often forgetting silly things and having to reteach yourself. But yeah, let's go ahead and actually include that route for the register method. There we go. And again, we are using some basic validators to make sure that the incoming data is valid and not a problem. And then let me switch back to Postman now. Oh, although we do have to do one quick thing here, actually. We're going to also go ahead and import that passport middleware and as well as the JWT feature file config file that we created earlier. So now let's switch back to Postman. Here we are in Postman. You can see here that I have the demonstration request pre-saved here. And I'm going to go ahead and post and make sure that this is functioning as we expect. Users not defined. I think I have mixed up my routes here. Where are we here? Routes. Get register, auth.register. We go into auth.register. And it says user is not defined, which shouldn't be a problem. All right. I'm going to go ahead and try to fix this quickly. If we send it again, let's see if there's an error. Oh, right. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that. Get rid of that. Oh. And now I think it should work. Let's try that again. I don't know what's happening here. All right, users not defined at exports.register, line 24. Let's go check that out. So sorry about this, guys. User.find one. Oh, right. We forgot to import that important model here. So let's go ahead and do that. So here we have the 3 important imports that we're going to need on this auth file. We're going to need to import the JWT, the schema that or file that we created, as well as the token and the user. Although for now we're not using the token or the JWT. So now we are connected, and I believe that should fix it. And where is the request now? There. So we registered, and it's working now. Although we already had the actual email registered. Yeah, coding live is indeed always fun. So let me go ahead and delete the user, and I will go again. And this is actually a great opportunity for me to introduce you guys to another tool, which you may or may not be familiar with. This is called Compass. It's a really useful tool. Let me quickly share that for you. What it's going to do for us is give us a more understandable, basic system for handling the, for interacting with the database without an actual command line. I actually am a big fan of this. But let's go back to Postman now. To finally complete our demonstration here, we have registered an account, and we see the hashed password. Everything is working exactly as we expect on the Postman. And indeed, that means that we should be able to log in. So let's give that a shot and hope that this doesn't break down. And indeed that we can see it is actually sending us back a JSON web token, which means that we have successfully completed most of our authentication steps. So let's switch back to the presentation and slow down for a second so we can talk a little bit about some of the things that just happened. So here we are. So what is a schema in Mongoose? Because we just talked about how the whole point of MongoDB is that we actually don't have a structured, defined way for our data to be. So the idea of a schema might seem a bit counterintuitive, but it would actually be quite problematic if we just sort of threw data into our database willy-nilly. Let's say that we accidentally have some problem in our code that that is going to create malformed data. If we go ahead and just throw that in our database without checking that it's in the right format, then we're going to run into some very big problems in terms of how predictable our server can expect the data to be. And also we're going to run into some very hard to fix bugs. And that's why we do actually do some software level type checking. But you can see that this way to define a schema is actually quite simple. It's much more intuitive and much more quick than having to go and actually write SQL or do it through an interface. That's a super frustrating and long process sometimes to configure structured databases. With this kind of a database, we really simply just go ahead and throw in basically just a JSON object, right? And it can get a lot of information from that and perform a lot of the functionality that we would get from a structured query language, an SQL database, without it. Someone asked if we're going to post the repo online. Absolutely. The code from this will be available if you want to take another look at it. Yeah, I'm sorry. We only have an hour and a half. We got to keep moving. But I did want to actually get through the actual code. And we'll go through it. If you guys want, I'm trying to get ahead so we have extra time as opposed to not enough. But if there's any particular piece of code that you guys want to go back over later, we'll have the opportunity during the Q&A session, and I can break down things a little more. So key points here. The type value is going to define the type of data that is going to be stored in that field. So this is going to be a string. It's also required. So this means that we're not going to have any situations where we accidentally submit we accidentally submit an object with malformed, the wrong type of username, and it's also not going to be undefined because it's required. And we're basically doing that for all of these example things here. And additionally, we have a third called unique, which is going to mean that it is required that only one object in this database has this email. And that's great for things like user registration, right? Where we need to make sure that there's only one email per user. Why are we not using MongoDB schema? This is a MongoDB schema, but it's just being done through Mongoose, which is a third-party tool. So here we have some very important schema design tips, after which I'm actually going to take a quick break to grab some water. Because of the nature of NoSQL databases, and particularly MongoDB, we have to have slightly different considerations than we would otherwise. And what I mean by that is, in SQL, we have this concept called a join. What a join is it sort of explains how different data sets are related to each other. So let's take, for example, Facebook. Facebook has a database with users on it, right? So it has a user. That user contains a certain amount of metadata about the user. So it might say their first name, their last name, password, username, etc. But then also Facebook's going to have to store all of the posts that user makes, right? And so typically what we would expect is that on SQL, we would use what is called a join to allow us to return all of these different data sets together. So let's say, for example, when I visit a user's profile, we're going to need to fetch that user and all of that user's posts at the same time. A join allows us to define how those different objects are related, and then make a request that returns all that data at once. In MongoDB, we have this idea of nested documents. So we can actually have the one of the fields be an entire other document. So we can sort of do database inception in a way, right? So I have a user, and then instead of having to create another database where I define all the posts, I have a posts object within that user object that contains all of the posts for that user. And I can even, through Mongoose, define schemas for those sub objects. So there's a lot of cases where this is a huge performance advantage. And it basically comes down to how often you need a object to be returned in what form, right? So if there's a case in which, first of all, you should favor embedding by default. So there's as integrated as you can make, as atomic as you can make your schema, the better. So if I only have to make one request, that's fantastic. So let's favor embedding by default. But then if there is a situation where an object really frequently needs to be returned on its own, let's say, for example, with the posts example from Facebook. So sometimes all I need is the post. If I'm scrolling through my timeline, I don't want necessarily to return a user and all of its posts just to be able to access one of the posts that user made. In that case, because that object needs to be returned on its own frequently, we won't embed, and we'll create another object and use what's called a software level join in Mongoose. And what that really means is that we're going to make multiple requests. So we're going to make one request to the user. We're going to get some identifying key that is a part of that user object, and then use that key to find all of the posts associated with that user in another table, in another collection. And one final schema design tip is to avoid unbounded arrays. Unbounded arrays can create really problematic unpredictability in terms of the size of documents and how they're indexed. So do not just randomly push and add items to an array. You should at least have a max length that Mongoose or MongoDB attempts to maintain. All right, so I'm going to take a little break. My colleague is going to talk to you guys for a moment. I'm going to get a drink of water, and I'll be back in a second to finish off this presentation, as well as go through the Q&A and do a little more step-by-step walking through the most important pieces of the code we just wrote. So yeah, thank you guys for your attention. I'll be back in a second.
All right, thank you, Gray, and really appreciate everyone's patience. I know we're popping with a lot of questions. We do have a lot of things to ask regarding how we actually want to take this up. I'm sure everyone has their set of questions, but yes, keep them parked for our Q&A session, which is going to happen right now after Gray finishes off his session. Guys, just want to share a little brief update about what's happening. I'm just sharing my screen. Just let me know if you can see my screen. All right. Okay. Great. Thank you. Okay, guys. Just what I was talking about is something which you are getting a taste of at the moment, which is more like a quick brush through session. But how about you going through in-depth and comprehensive training, not just with Gray, but another industry expert, Mr. Aditya Dua as well, who is equally experienced, equally knowledgeable, and having loads and loads of patience to explain each and every one about what's going to come in the next 2 months. So starting 6th March, we are coming up with live online training for full stack with a mean e-stack degree. So this is a 2-month long session wherein you be actually be integrated, or rather working closely with the experts, which can actually help you out with all your doubts, with all the things which you need. This session starts on the 6th of March. It's a weekend only session, and it's exclusive for 50 seats only. And as we speak, as I said, it's only left with 9 seats. So during this session, I'll be sharing the registration link for you guys, so you can move ahead and just make your registration so you are comfortably placed for this upcoming session. So the best part, as I mentioned, there is a surprise coming up with the registration as well. So stay tuned. Don't worry. Also, along with it, as I promised before, we are going to have uh, um, a, a free giveaway for each and every one of you, the participants who are participating in this session will actually also get a free goodie from Eduonix. So without taking much time, I'll of course keep you updated about what's coming up. Let's go back to Gray when he'll be able to complete, and we'll be able to start the Q&A very quickly. So Gray, if you're back, I'll stop my screen share. Are you available?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. I'm going to quickly share the presentation then. All right. All right, so thank you for staying with us. So here are some of the major security concerns that we'll be considering with a REST API. And this is the last important topic I'll be covering before we go into the Q&A and a little more talking about the code. So as I mentioned before, there is this XSS attacks, these XSS attack vulnerabilities that we should consider, and the CORS-based solution And then we also touched on data validation. And we also touched a little bit on password hashing. So why am I harping so much on security? So for a lot of us, before we get involved in being back-end software engineers, or full stack engineers for that matter, there might be this sort of, get it done, like let's move, let's get the, the minimum viable product done so we can keep moving, type of mentality. I know I had that, especially as a beginning programmer. But when we're making backends, we actually have to be a little more systematic and think pretty hard about the flow of our data, what that means for our users, especially, and what that means for us, because we're actually handling quite sensitive information, even though as developers, we might make a bunch of websites and think of user registration as a somewhat trivial thing to handle. It really is trust that your users are putting in you when they give you their data and allow you to store it, especially when it comes to passwords, because as we know, no one is actually good at, you can't trust that your users aren't going to use the same password for everything. And if we leak one of their passwords, that could legitimately affect their life. And so, thinking about these major security concerns all the time throughout the development process is really important. And that's why you should never store or transmit the password in plain text. So in this example, we actually didn't transmit the password in plain text. But in a real production environment, the best practice is to encrypt, have the browser, the user's browser, encrypt using bcrypt hash the password and then send it on. There's never any reason to store or transmit the plain text of the password. As the developers, we don't even need to know what their password is. So that is the number one concern. Second, with data validation, we have these potential attacks called injection attacks. So if any of you have had any sort of black hat hacker teenage phase, as I did a little bit as a young teenager, you'll know about SQL injection attacks. They're basically this really nasty kind of attack where we use the fact that a lot of the people writing code that handles user input aren't thinking too much about what the users can do with that input. And they can basically use syntax, use special characters, and use the software that's interpreting the user input to try to mess with it and trick it and maybe exploit it to run arbitrary code. Which is a huge problem for us. And that's why we use that express validator middleware that we touched on a little bit earlier with those check mechanisms. So as the data comes in, we ensure that it adheres to a uniform format and structure. All right, we've made it to the Q&A section. So the way I want to do this is I'm going to open it up to the chat, and I'll be reading some questions from chat. Let's start a little bit more specifically about the topic of the webinar, and then we can move on to more general questions once those questions have been addressed. So what code do we want to go over? What questions do you guys have about the process we just went through? What are the key understandings that you guys want out of this question session? Which pattern did you use to set up the files? So I mentioned earlier, I believe you're talking about the structure of the directories. I'm using basically a loosely adapted model view controller split. So the model being the interaction with the data, with the actual data, the controller being the connection between the user and the data, and the view being the front end, which we're actually not doing today. So today we're just handling the models and the controllers, right? So we have that, the controllers, and then the features folder I just use for sort of these de facto boilerplate configuration for modules, for NPM modules. So not all of these are middlewares, not all of them, but the key ones that are middlewares, and let me quickly switch to sharing my VS Code here so you guys can see that. There we go. So the key middlewares that we're using here are not Express, but express.json, express.url encoded. We're also using cores, and we're actually passing our routes file as a middleware, technically speaking. And then bcrypt, JWT, and Passport are not really middlewares, although as you can see in this, sorry, I just turned off my camera by accident. As you can see in this file, we actually are defining our own type of middleware, which is being passed by Passport. So Passport is a kind of middleware, but it actually requires a little more configuration to tell it what the middleware does. And you can see us telling it to use the middleware here in the routes folder. What is CORS? So I touched on this a little bit earlier. CORS stands for cross-origin resource sharing, and it has to do with, it's basically a safety mechanism for making sure that all requests that are happening between a user's browser and the backend or any resource that needs to be requested except for the primary app logic that we're fetching from that primary server. We need to regulate those kinds of connections because they can be potentially dangerous to allow. And so that's what CORS does. It's a rule set that browsers use to navigate that kind of problem. Which one is better, ExpressJS or Next? I assume you mean Next.js. They're not really comparable, but I like ExpressJS for backends a lot. Do we have to set up an API key when working off APIs we created, or is it only for public APIs? So that's what that JWT token is. Obviously, you can use any authentication scheme you want. I'm operating off the assumption in this example that this is a separated backend for a front end. So this would want to be, we would want this to be able to be interacted with like a normal application, something like Facebook. And so we want to offer user and password authentication, but really that user and password authentication is just a way to get to the normal API key authentication, which we're doing using JSON web tokens. How did you create a project on VS Code? I've never used this tool. You've never used VS Code? VS Code is a really nice IDE. I really like it. Highly recommend it. If you do any coding, I'm surprised you haven't heard of it. Can we do the same thing in Chrome as we can do in Postman? So we can visit the same URLs, and we could technically do it using the Chrome developer tools, I believe, but it would be a much bigger pain in the butt to do. So Postman basically is a very specific software, which is really good at that one kind of task. And that's why I prefer using it over Chrome. Can you elaborate on the single-threaded nature of Node.js? I mean, sure. So, I mean, it uses the event loop because it's based on JavaScript. Basically, what that means is that Node.js is going to handle one task at a time, one little thing at a time, and it handles it sort of line by line. Although we have these asynchronous patterns to allow us to get out of that. So although Node.js is technically a single-threaded, it doesn't actually behave as much like a single-threaded program as you would expect. How can we check the existence of the access token? So typically, there's a lot of questions here. I'm trying to get through them all. So typically what we would do is we would store the token in local storage. So the user would put it in their, would log in, and then we would attach that token that we returned from the API, save it to their local storage, and then attach that with every request that we send out. And then that's how we check the existence. We consume that as they make the request, and you can see the logic here is going to handle actually validating that token and making sure it works. and is signed by us. Can I elaborate more on the passport flow and what other strategies are available to authenticate? I'll touch on this very briefly. Basically, you can have any strategy. I'm using the Passport.js library, which exposes some default strategies, but you can actually write a custom strategy. So there's basically any endless amount of ways that you could program Passport to handle authentication. I believe it might even be able to integrate with OAuth, but I'm not 100% sure on that. You can go on the JWT NPM page to see some of the strategies that they, I believe, link to. And I think there are a bunch of libraries that provide some of those defaults. And I believe there are also some defaults included with Passport. How do we protect the token from being stolen? So that's a really good question. There's two main things we can do. We can either try to keep it from ever being accessible to the end user, which is pretty much impractical, or we can just invalidate the tokens regularly. So one of the best ways to make sure that the token, to deal with the problem of the token being stealable, is to just make sure that the tokens don't last very long. So if we only make them last a couple hours, then the fact that a hacker would only have access for a couple hours to that token would mean that it's not quite as dangerous. And then additionally, you would typically try to store, if possible, your authentication information as an HTTP only cookie, meaning that the end user can't even technically access it, although there are some caveats to that. Is MVC ideal for building RESTful APIs? In my opinion, whatever sort of system for organizing the different features of your code and for handling separation of concerns works for you is ideal, right? So whatever you're most comfortable with and used to and makes the most intuitive sense to you is probably just the most logical way to split it. But I find this to be really nice. I find it to be a very useful abstraction. Where to start it from a beginner? Go on YouTube and just search up how to get started with Node.js, I would say. Could I please provide a valid URL? Not really sure what that means. Besides Axios, are there any other ways to receive and send requests? So what Kagiso, and I'm probably completely butchering your username there, is trying to talk about is this library called Axios, which is a library that allows the browser, or indeed even us here on the back end, to create and send HTTP requests rather than accept them. So I actually prefer the default node fetch. Fetch is a default API that's included as part of browsers by standard, as a standard now. And people have made a polymorphic version of it, meaning that they've made one that also works server side. So I prefer the fetch API personally over Axios, but I know a lot of people do like Axios. What is process env used for? What is it and what is it used for? So going into our env configuration, an env, an environment configuration, .env is the library that this integrates with, is going to load onto the process.env object. And this is basically hooking into an already existing system, which I touched on earlier, called environment variables. So I can actually set environment variables through my Windows settings. But I can also pretend to set them using this .env file. And basically what it's for is protecting secrets. So imagine that this was a real password that I needed to protect. If I went ahead and posted this to GitHub, we'd have a pretty huge problem, right? Because now my password's just on GitHub. And so you'd think that that would be a rare thing, but it's really not. It's actually one of the most common security problems that people have, is accidentally just posting their own passwords online, and that's as developers. So we use .env to stop that from happening. And And yes, you can also, like, if I'm on something like Amazon Web Services, I can also set environment variables there without a .env file. And so we're sort of hooking into this already existing system of variables and just doing it in a little more simple and maintainable of a way using these .env files. I also posted my API key as public on GitHub. I mean, I think anyone who messed around with it, messes around with web development at first makes that same mistake. That's how it be. Making that mistake before you're working on a production product with an actual big team of developers, it's probably great, you know, make the mistakes while they're low stakes. Is AWS a wiser choice than Heroku? So AWS is a cheaper choice than Heroku, that's for sure. Although I think that Heroku has a lot of really nice things to offer in terms of its automation and in terms of its ease of use. And as a full stack engineer, this is part of the full stack course. As you guys know, this is sort of a sneak preview of the type of content that we cover in the full stack course. As a full stack developer, often it actually is really worth it to simplify all of these administrative tasks because we have so many different things on our plate. And so you do have to try to keep everything manageable. So I can't really recommend AWS or Heroku over each other. It really comes down to the context and how good you are at using AWS. Can I please explain again the security of using a .env file instead of a normal .properties file? So it's not that the .env is more secure than just storing it as a file. It's more that we want to be able to also use this system of environment variables, right? So .env actually won't even, like, this .env file won't exist on the production server of this code. Instead, we're going to actually set the environment variables through the operating system because the operating system can set environment variables. And that's just perfect because that's kind of the best place to store actual secrets, right? Is at the operating system level. We would prefer not to store them in plain text or any way else, really, as unexposed to the real world and the internet as we can make our secrets, the better. Can I please explain RESTful? I mean, I can go over the idea of a RESTful API again, sure. So the RESTful sort of architecture is basically just a very standardized way to handle communication between two different services, right? So if there's two different programs running, they're going to need to communicate. Typically, this will happen over the internet, especially due to the fact that cloud-based solutions are so popular and at this point ubiquitous. Because of that, we're going to need to communicate between these two services using the internet. And because of that, we're going to have to use some protocol. So HTTPS is a fantastic protocol. So REST takes advantage of HTTPS for security. And it allows us to use super standard communication mechanisms and just really commonplace standards to handle that communication. And as web developers, we're already quite familiar with how HTTP requests work, the format that they take, all of the configuration that goes into creating an HTTP request. And because of that, that makes RESTful APIs a really obvious solution because they allow us to just use that kind of a format and that kind of a structure for communication between services. As an entry-level full-stack developer, I have been using PostgreSQL, and I love working with SQL, but MongoDB looks a lot easier. Is there any particular reason why most devs companies use MongoDB over Postgres? So, and I'm definitely saying Postgres wrong. I don't know. I've always said it like that, but I'm pretty sure that's random. So MongoDB is great because it is great for rapid development. In the past 10, 20 years, product like people who are in charge, project managers and people at the top, have gotten really interested in making development rapid because I mean, that's just sort of been the way things are moving, and it also enables for more trial and error. And as we know, most businesses fail anyway. So getting to the minimum viable product and finding out that the product is going to fail faster is better for everyone. And so essentially that's a big driving factor. And what gives us all of these ease of use focused technologies rather than performance focused technologies, sort of taking the limelight in the development arena. It's just, we've realized that, you know, there actually is a lot of value, not only in making performant applications, but in making applications that are easy to develop, because we're going to save a lot of man hours, and especially because developers are so expensive, and development is so incredibly expensive. Rapidity has become the key. So Firebase is basically, you know, in my mind, the same as Amazon Web Services. Someone asked what my opinion on Firebase is. Yeah, it's just another one of these cloud service providers. Although it does have a little more, as I understand it, a little more expectations to it than AWS. It's a little less platform agnostic. I've heard good things. I think that the more competitors there are in the space, the better. And each of the individual cloud providers tend to have really high value offerings in one place or another that are a really good deal. And it's just a matter of picking and choosing from each of those services for what works best for you. We're sort of getting towards the end of the session here. We're going to be wrapping up soon.
All right, great. So sorry to barge in, but yeah, I see that so many questions coming in with regards to the today's session, which is kind of giving me a clear indication about the interest levels in the audience today, as well as the curiosity they have, would like to, you know, explore this more. But guys, with all respect to everyone's questions, I would actually just quickly barge in to explain you what's coming up or what's in store for you guys, along with the surprise. Now, quite a few are keen to understand what's the what's the live training all about. Some of you did ask me on a personal chat level as well, so I'm actually not keeping you guys waiting. I'll just quickly share my screen, Gray, and in the meantime I will also here you go. Okay, so guys, this is, as I mentioned, it's a 2-month long session. Just a few quick highlights about what's in store for you guys. As I mentioned, it's exclusively set to 50 seats purely. We want to have a personalized attention towards each and every one of you. We have our global global level instructors who are actually going to conduct quite a few portfolio arrangements. There are going to be assignments which will be verified with these guys, as well as most of us are not sure about how it will help us in the real world. So our instructors are patient enough, kind enough to, of course, help you guys to understand how we can implement these, or the real practical knowledge which you guys are actually looking for. Right at the start, I had asked you questions, and the most striking question which I had heard about was, they want practice, they want real-time projects. So here's the opportunity for you to actually get yourself into it, as well as get certified. So this is an industry verified certified certification course, which is a 2-month long course, and it's not going to affect your schedule because it's on a weekend. 2 hours each day on a Saturday and Sunday is not going to harm you for the next 8 weeks. It's going to start this Saturday, which is the 6th of March. Some of the projects I've just listed, a few which will be covered during the session. Just for your reference, I thought I'll just share this with you. Guys, also, this is just a glimpse of the certificate which we are looking at the end of the successful live training with such lovely instructors. Lastly, just the tools covered. Wanted to let you know. Now, here's the thing. I'm sharing the link right away on the chat right now, just make sure you're able to open it and explore the link right now and complete your registrations. As I mentioned, these are very limited seats, and I would be really, really glad to inform you that you make sure you use opportunity to take this with full, with both your hands. Purely why? Because if you check on the website right now, the offer actually is not available, because it's $150 for your seat registration for the 2 months. But here, a spot bonus of 66% off. We're knocking it off at $99. We're giving it away at $99. That's just because we left with last few seats available, and we want to ensure we have our full strength 50 seat for our upcoming session. So guys, now or never is the opportunity. This is the place where you can actually just go for it and take the offer right away. I have embedded the code for you, so all you do is just go ahead with the link which I have mentioned on the chat. Guys, let me know if you are able to open this link, and if you're able to register uh, quickly. If you guys can just let me know who all have registered, would be really, really helpful. In the meantime, Gray, if you're around, we can also quickly take a couple of questions if you don't mind. Yeah,
Yeah,
Ahmad, I'm
absolutely.
resending the link here. Yeah, sorry, Gray, go on. I'll be on mute.
Yeah, no worries at all. Thank you. Yeah, so someone asked what a token is. So the primary way that we do authentication on the internet that we're used to as users and potentially as developers for some of you is session-based authentication. And session-based authentication basically attaches a unique ID to the session cookies on your browser, and it is attached with each request. And they're typically stored as HTTP only cookies as well. Now, the main difference between storing a JSON web token instead of storing this unique ID is that a JSON web token is actually provable. It's cryptographically secure because we know that we signed it. So when this user provides that authentication information, we know based on the authentication information, A, that they definitely logged in with us because we signed it. We can cryptographically prove it. And we can also take a payload from that JSON web token. So there can be some data stored within our JSON web token, such as the user's username, maybe the user's email, whatever really key information that we need to have access to. And you can see how that adds some sort of conveniences for us, right? It allows us to make the process more stateless, because each time that the person sends in their information, we have the context stored within their authentication information rather than stored within application state. What is the name of the tool that I mentioned earlier during the session? So I mentioned a few tools. The tool that we are using for testing the APIs is called Postman, and I'll go ahead and send this in the chat. The tool that we're using for providing a GUI interface for MongoDB is called MongoDB Compass, which I'll also send in the chat. And then also the IDE which I'm using, which most of you are probably familiar with, is called VS Code, and it is by far my favorite. What Eduonix will, I believe, pass the code on to you after the session. Right, that is all the questions I see.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Great, thank you, Gray. Well, what's the so the best part is, I'll tell you what, Gray is going to be available for in-depth session, as I mentioned, for the upcoming live training, which is organized by Eduonix Learning Solutions. We are just looking for ensuring that you are getting the offer right away and blocking your seats. Anyone who has actually made a spot registration right away, just let me know on the chat. I just need to make sure that you are showing up on our panel. So yeah, so that's by the way LinkedIn link from Gray. You can get in touch with him as well. Um, all right. So Andrew mentions it's worked and is booked in. Okay, great. I'll have a look at it quickly. Andrew, thank you so much, guys. Anyone else who is keen or who wants to register, just quickly go ahead with the link and just let me know if you are able to complete the registration. And also, as promised before, I am also sharing the free giveaway goodie for us, for Eduonix, all of you to have a look at and enroll for yourself for free. Here's the free giveaway link for you. So guys, just make sure you're enrolling because this is just for the attendees, for the people who have attended. Paul, thank you so much. I see your message as enrolled. I'll quickly have a look at the backend once I've stopped my screen share. And I'll, of course, you will get a confirmation email as well from our backend team shortly. Uh, Guys, other than that, on behalf of the entire audience, I would like to thank Gray for being so patient, being so so quick, and also explaining each and every question which we have taken up on the chat. And I'm sure everyone who's joined from all across the world today had some Gray cells added to them today, especially with the mean stack interest in this. And I'm very glad to see such a huge turnout today. Gray, anything you'd like to say, like a thank you note from your side?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely thank you all for showing up. I have a great time doing these sessions, and it's always great getting to connect with some people who are passionate about coding as well. Like I said, please reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn if you have any more questions about the session, or if you just want to chat about anything code. But yeah, thank you so much, and thank you, Vivek, as well, for being such a fantastic host.
Awesome, thank you, and you're welcome, Gray. It's really nice to know you such beautiful people across the world. Gray, just one thing from my side as well, from Eduonix side as well. Really appreciate you sparing time, especially on a weekday. I know everyone's busy with work. We are going through such challenging times, but yeah, everyone's staying strong to ensure that they are moving ahead, progressing and learning. And Eduonix provides such a beautiful platform from each and every one of you to ensure that you are upskilled yourself to be prepared for the next job or your dream job. uh, yeah, by the way, one last thing as well. At the in about another 30 to 35 minutes, you should receive an email talking about the feedback about our session today. Guys, we would love to know how you found this session. Please ensure you put your honest comments on that form, so that we can be better each time whenever we come next to you. So guys, one last time, I'm just calling out the link so that you guys can make the most of the registrations. I haven't checked, but when I started the webinar, we had about 9 seats available. I have just entered the code for the one last time, guys, before we can end the session. And really thank each and every one of you on behalf of Gray as well as in Eduonix. We thank you for being such a lovely audience, being so patient and taking this session. Thank you, each and every one of you. And if you have any more questions, I'll just allow one more minute before we can say goodbye to each other. Thank you, each and every one of you. I'm sorry I can't take all the names out on the chat right now, but I see a lot of thank you comments for Gray. Thank you for Eduonix as well. So really appreciate all your comments and all the love. Please do visit eduonix.com. That's a e-learning solutions platform for your learning as well. So thank you. So one last question before we go. There's someone is asking about GitHub. What is your GitHub, Gray?
You can go to the URL gray.software to check out my GitHub.
All right. So that answers your question. So I will take your leave. Gray, thank you so much again. And
Thank you.
thank you everyone for being such a lovely audience. I would request if you guys, if you're done, you can just leave the session today. Thank you. And people, one last thing before I guys allow you to go is I would also extend this people who are not able to make a spot decision. I would recommend we can also go ahead and make this registration on an email. You'll receive an email in the next 10 minutes. Make sure you are utilizing the same offer which I just was giving you as a spot offer, but that's valid for the next 3 hours from now. So will be ending the session. It's valid for the next 3 hours on the email. After the next 3 hours, the code will get deactivated. So make sure people who are not able to make any impulsive decision or make any spot bookings, just make sure you are able to take this opportunity and get the pay the $99 for an upcoming fruitful live training session. All right. So on behalf of Gray as well as Eduonix Learning Solutions, I am Vivek, your host. I would sign off with you right now. All right. Thank you, everyone. It was really lovely, lovely talking to each one of you. Thank you.